Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Shroudex. Most Foundation files this channel has ever covered describe a room, a cell, a chamber, a door with a number stenciled onto it, something built specifically to hold a threat in one place. This file describes a stretch of Siberia roughly the size of a small country, and something this archive almost never puts into writing so plainly. An admission that the problem was never actually solved. There's no chamber holding this one, no wall thick enough, just a line drawn across a map, and standing orders to shoot anything that crosses it. This is SCP-610, the flesh that hates. This channel has covered suns that end the world, gods older than language, and a salesman terrified of his own boss. This file is a different kind of frightening entirely, because nothing about it is exaggerated for effect. It reads like exactly what it is. An honest, procedural account of the one time this organization looked at a problem, tried everything available to it, and simply couldn't finish the job. Item number 610. Object Class Keter. One of the oldest, most referenced entries in this entire archive, and once you understand what its containment section actually says, one of the most quietly unusual Keter files this channel has ever covered. Our orientation episode explained what that classification usually promises. Difficult, costly, never fully guaranteed, but still, in almost every other case, actively being attempted. Most Keter files describe an organization straining against a threat with everything it has. Cells reinforced past reasonable limits, task forces on permanent standby, procedures updated every time something new is learned. This file breaks that pattern in its very first lines, not with a wall. With a sentence most Foundation documents this channel has ever read out loud, simply never include. Containment is impossible. Compare that admission to the locked box test our very first episode on this channel explained. Put an anomaly in a sealed box. If nothing happens, safe. If you don't know what will happen, Euclid, if it gets out easily, Keter. This file breaks even that test. The box was never a realistic option in the first place, and the file says so in plain language, rather than pretending otherwise for the sake of looking capable. It's worth sitting with how rare that kind of institutional honesty actually is across this entire archive. Most files, even ones documenting catastrophic failures, tend to frame the outcome in terms of ongoing effort, containment procedures still being refined, research still active, hope technically still on the table. This file skips that framing entirely and states its actual position in 4 words that any viewer with no background in this archive at all could understand immediately. Every outbreak needs a first thread to pull, and this one starts with the Russian government itself, reporting something through channels the file never names directly. It began small. Farmers going missing in ones and twos from a remote rural stretch of the country nobody outside that region would have any reason to think about. Local police were sent to investigate first, the ordinary, unremarkable response to a handful of missing persons reports. When they didn't come back with answers, regional police followed. When that failed too, a single government agent was dispatched specifically to find out what had happened to everyone sent before him. None of them reported back within 72 hours. Not delayed, not partial. Completely silent, every single time, regardless of how much authority or manpower had been sent in to follow up on the last silence. There's a specific kind of dread built into that escalation pattern, one this file leans on without ever needing to state it outright. Each response sent in was larger and better equipped than the one before it, and each one still vanished within the same 72-hour window regardless. That consistency is more disturbing than randomness would have been. Whatever was happening out there wasn't overwhelming its victims through numbers or luck. It was operating on a timeline that simply didn't care how much force showed up to interrupt it. Notice, too, how deliberately this file avoids naming its original source. Reports coming in through channels the file won't name isn't an oversight. It's the same compartmentalization instinct our orientation episode explained in detail, information restricted even inside a document meant to be read by cleared Foundation personnel, because whatever generated that first report was sensitive enough that its origin needed protecting even from readers already trusted with everything else in this file. The affected region sits close to Lake Baikal, in the far south of Siberia, a genuinely remote stretch of the country chosen by nobody, simply the place where this particular outbreak happened to begin. Every known infection site is marked on Foundation field maps, ringed by a perimeter line the file itself renders in blue against the infection's red. Here's the detail worth sitting with the longest. As of the most recent update reflected in this file, no new locations have ever been confirmed beyond that original boundary. Whatever pushed this threat across an area the size of a small country did all of its damage early, and has, for reasons the file never fully explains, simply stopped expanding since. That stillness isn't the same as victory. It's closer to a held breath that's lasted for decades. It's worth asking why a threat capable of this much damage in its opening days would simply stop expanding at all, and the file offers no answer. Maybe the terrain itself works against further spread. Maybe whatever drives the infection has some limit built into it the Foundation hasn't identified yet. Or maybe, and this is the possibility this file seems least willing to rule out, it hasn't stopped at all, and simply hasn't needed to cross that boundary yet for reasons nobody outside the perimeter has any way of knowing. Before the Foundation ever became involved, a small Russian military unit was sent into the region, standard procedure for a country responding to unexplained rural disappearances on its own soil. They withdrew quickly. The file doesn't elaborate on what they actually saw out there, and that silence is doing more narrative work than a detailed account ever could. It was that unexplained retreat, not the original missing farmers, that finally escalated this case to the Foundation's attention. Think about the chain of failure required to get to that point. Local police failed. Regional police failed. A trained military unit with weapons and numbers failed quickly enough that whatever they encountered didn't need to be explained in writing for the report to register as an emergency. There's a specific kind of institutional embarrassment buried in that sequence too, worth naming plainly. A sovereign nation's own armed forces were driven out of a stretch of their own territory quickly enough that no official account of the reason survives in this file. Governments don't usually admit that kind of failure easily, and the fact that Russia handed the situation over to an outside organization entirely, rather than escalating with more of its own military resources, suggests whatever those soldiers reported back was serious enough to skip several rungs of the usual chain of command entirely. Here's where the file's honesty becomes genuinely rare in this archive. There's no facility on record, anywhere in the Foundation's entire holdings, large enough to hold ground measured in hundreds of square kilometers. Moving the infected material elsewhere was ruled out, too, since transport risked spreading exactly what everyone was trying to prevent from spreading further in the first place. What was left wasn't containment, in the sense this channel's orientation episode explained it. It was isolation, and that's the specific word the file itself uses, deliberately distinct from containment. Geography doing the actual work no wall ever could, watched rather than held, managed rather than solved. That distinction between isolation and containment matters more than it might sound like on a first read. Containment implies control, an active relationship where the Foundation dictates the terms an anomaly has to live under. Isolation implies something closer to a truce nobody actually agreed to, a boundary that holds only because nothing inside it has tried hard enough yet to cross it in a way the perimeter can't stop. The Russian government granted permission for a permanent perimeter around the region, and the cover story chosen for it tells you everything about how seriously this needed to stay hidden. Publicly, it's presented as an ongoing military exercise. Nothing more dramatic than routine training, repeated indefinitely, for reasons nobody outside a small circle of officials is ever given. Checkpoints, fencing, patrols, all of it dressed in the ordinary, forgettable language of a training zone rather than a quarantine. A civilian vehicle wandering too close gets calmly redirected, given no real explanation, sent on their way without ever suspecting they'd just been steered away from one of this archive's largest ongoing containment failures. There's something worth noticing about how long a cover story like that has to hold up before it stops being a temporary measure and becomes something closer to a permanent second identity for an entire stretch of land. Training exercises end. Governments announce troop rotations, publish schedules, eventually stand down. A cover story running for decades without ever being allowed to conclude isn't really a cover story anymore. It's a second, quieter truth about that region that has simply replaced the first one for everyone without the clearance to know better. Anything showing signs of infection near the perimeter is engaged from a distance first, small arms fire, until movement stops entirely. Then it's destroyed completely using incendiary weapons, fired from as far away as the available equipment allows. Nobody gets close enough to confirm anything by hand if it can possibly be avoided. Anyone who makes physical contact with infected material is considered lost the instant it happens. No exceptions, no waiting period, no benefit of the doubt. Even getting within 3 meters of infected biological material triggers immediate withdrawal, isolation from the rest of the team, and remote examination only from that point forward. It's a rule book built entirely around the assumption that hesitation, not the infection itself, is what actually gets people killed out there. Notice, too, what's absent from this protocol compared to almost every other engagement procedure this channel has covered. No negotiation clause, no attempt at recovery for study, no exception carved out for command staff or specialists who might argue their expertise justifies closer proximity. The rulebook here was written by people who had already tried the version with more flexibility built in and watched that version fail badly enough that flexibility itself became the thing to eliminate first. It's also worth asking what this protocol implies about command structure at the perimeter itself. Somewhere, someone had to write the specific number, 3 meters, into an official procedure, which means someone had already lost people at 2 meters or 1 before that number became policy. Every distance requirement in this file reads less like a calculated safety margin and more like a lesson paid for in casualties, then quietly converted into a rule so the next team wouldn't have to relearn it the same way. It starts small enough to ignore completely. A rash, some itching, skin that feels a little more sensitive than it should, the kind of symptom most people would treat with lotion and forget about by the next morning. Nothing about that first hour would send anyone to a hospital, and that's precisely what makes it so effective. Nobody reacts fast enough because nothing about it looks urgent yet. By the 3-hour mark, the rash has become something else entirely. Thick, scar-like tissue spreading visibly across the chest and arms. Within another hour, it reaches the legs and back. By the 5-hour mark, the entire body is covered, every inch of it, in tissue that no longer resembles human skin in any meaningful way. Cold Siberian air, unintentionally, works in the Foundation's favor here, slowing the process down. Heat does the exact opposite. Under high enough temperatures, that same 5-hour transformation has been recorded, finishing in as little as 5 minutes. A timeline so compressed, it leaves almost no window at all between first symptom and total loss. Sit with the shape of that timeline for a moment, because it's doing something most infection horror on this channel hasn't attempted before. There's no dramatic countdown clock, no visible ticking toward disaster. The horror here is procedural, near clinical, a rash becoming a symptom, becoming a transformation on a schedule that barely allows time to seek help, let alone receive it. By the time anyone watching the process from the outside would think to call for medical attention, the 5-hour window has likely already closed. That's what makes the heat-accelerated version of this infection genuinely nightmarish to consider. 5 minutes isn't a window for intervention. It's barely enough time to notice something's wrong before there's nothing left to intervene on. Every protocol this file has already shown you, the distance requirements, the immediate incineration, the refusal to attempt recovery, starts to make a lot more sense once you understand just how little time separates a minor rash from something the Foundation no longer considers a person at all. Once the transformation completes, every vital function in the body stops. Full stop, not a slowdown. For almost exactly 3 minutes, there's nothing. No pulse, no movement. To anyone watching, without knowing what comes next, it would look and would be recorded as a death. Then it restarts, faster than before and different, because the tissue itself begins to move on its own, independent of anything resembling the nervous system that used to control it. That 3-minute window of total stillness might be the single most unsettling detail in this entire file, not because of what it does, but because of what it invites. It's just long enough for someone to believe it's over, and just short enough that believing that gets them killed. Think about what that 3-minute gap would actually mean for anyone present without full knowledge of the file's own documented timeline. A soldier, a researcher, a family member who followed someone into that room. Every human instinct built around confirming a death, checking for a pulse, waiting to be sure, becomes actively dangerous here. The file doesn't need to spell out how many of its own personnel likely learned that lesson the hard way before the 3-minute rule made it into official documentation. Early in this file's history, manned expeditions were still attempted. Researchers and personnel willing to physically enter the perimeter to gather first-hand information the way this channel has shown you the Foundation usually operates. Records of any expedition since are either non-existent in the available file or classified well beyond what any outside account can access. Whatever the actual reason, the practical result reads the same either way. Nobody documented has gone in and come back to describe it firsthand, not for a long time. Everything the Foundation currently knows about the interior of that zone comes exclusively from unmanned drones, flying reconnaissance passes that keep every human observer safely outside the line. Air samples collected this way have shown trace particulate capable of spreading infection under the right conditions, though most exposure through the air alone needs days before it takes hold. Direct contact with exposed internal tissue works dramatically faster, which is precisely why every protocol at the perimeter is built around preventing contact above almost everything else. Compare that reliance on drones to almost every other entry this channel has broken down. Most files describe personnel going in, gathering samples, running tests, however dangerous the process turns out to be. This file describes an organization that has quietly, permanently retreated from that model altogether, choosing distance over data, and accepting an incomplete picture of its own case file as the acceptable cost of keeping its remaining staff alive. There's a quiet kind of tragedy in that particular trade-off, too. The Foundation's entire mission, across every file this channel has ever covered, is built on the idea that understanding an anomaly is the first step toward eventually controlling it. Here, understanding itself became too expensive to keep pursuing, and the organization chose ignorance deliberately and permanently over the alternative of continuing to lose personnel for information that never once led to a solution. The file's own language for the current approach doesn't try to soften anything about what it actually is. A scorched earth policy stated exactly that plainly in the Foundation's own documentation. Nothing crossing the line survives contact with it. Nothing inside the line is expected to ever be recovered. It isn't a solution, and the file never pretends otherwise. It's an admission that a solution was never actually found, dressed in the operational language of a policy rather than the emotional language of defeat, because that's the only language this organization's own paperwork is built to use. There's a specific kind of restraint in how flatly the file states this policy, too. No justification offered, no ethical framing, no attempt to soften a strategy that amounts to permanently sacrificing part of a country's own territory rather than solving the problem sitting on it. Compare that to our orientation episode's explanation of the Foundation's founding mission: secure, contain, protect. This file is the sound of an organization quietly admitting that, on this specific case, only the third word in that mission statement is still achievable, and only by giving up entirely on the first two. The core file is honest about one more thing, and it might be the most important admission in the entire document. It doesn't actually know where SCP-610 came from. One line hints at a connection to some failed project before the details are redacted entirely, cut off mid-explanation the way this channel's earlier episodes have shown you redactions usually work, protecting whoever's reading the file as much as whatever secret sits underneath the black bar. There's a separate, expanded piece of community lore worth mentioning here, clearly and deliberately kept apart from what the core article itself actually confirms. That secondary material ties SCP-610 to an ancient Sarkic bioweapon, built during a mythic conflict referred to as the War of the Flesh, and later resurfaces this same entity as something called the Red Death, inside a completely separate, alternate canon event elsewhere in this archive. That theory is genuinely popular across this community, and it's worth knowing about if you want the full picture of how this entry has grown in the public imagination. But it's a different story, told by different authors in a different corner of this archive entirely. The file we've spent this entire episode breaking down never confirms any of it. It simply admits, honestly, that it doesn't know and leaves that uncertainty standing exactly where the redaction cuts off. It's worth being honest about why a gap like that tends to get filled so eagerly by outside material in the first place. An origin left genuinely unknown is uncomfortable, in a way most readers instinctively want resolved, and a rich, detailed alternate explanation. Ancient bioweapons, mythic wars, a named villain behind an unnamed horror is a much more satisfying story than an official shrug. That satisfaction is exactly why this channel is drawing such a hard line around it here. The expanded lore might be more fun to imagine. It isn't what this specific file actually says. None of that makes the secondary lore worthless, and it's genuinely worth exploring on its own terms if you're curious about it. It just isn't this file, and conflating the two would misrepresent exactly the kind of source accuracy this channel has built its entire reputation on maintaining. Most Foundation entries this channel has covered eventually get answers. Better containment methods developed over time, better understanding of the underlying mechanism. Occasionally, in rarer cases, something closer to genuine neutralization. That's the pattern our orientation episode described as the organization's whole reason for existing: secure, contain, and eventually understand. This file has had decades, and the answer hasn't meaningfully changed since the perimeter was first drawn. Same fence, same cover story, same scorched earth policy, repeated year after year without any real progress to report beneath it. Sometimes, the most honest thing an organization built specifically to contain the impossible can do is admit, plainly in its own internal paperwork, that on this particular file, it simply can't. It's worth comparing that stagnation to how this channel has described other long-running files across previous episodes. Even our darkest SCP-001 proposals describe organizations still actively fighting, still developing new countermeasures, still hoping for eventual resolution, no matter how distant that hope might be. This file doesn't offer that same forward motion. Decades of monitoring have produced the same fence, the same cover story, and the same policy, essentially unchanged, which suggests the Foundation isn't waiting for a breakthrough here so much as it's simply waiting indefinitely for nothing in particular to happen. That kind of open-ended waiting is a very different flavor of horror than anything else this channel has broken down. Most threats resolve one way or another, eventually. This one simply continues, year after year, with no confirmed end state built into its own documentation, which means every single person assigned to that perimeter today inherited a problem their predecessors never solved and will very likely hand the exact same unsolved problem to whoever gets assigned there next. So that's SCP-610. The flesh that hates, no cell, no chamber. Just a fence, a cover story about routine military training, and a scorched earth policy that amounts to holding the problem at arm's length rather than ever actually solving it. A rash that becomes total transformation in 5 hours, 5 minutes, if the weather cooperates against you. 3 minutes of total stillness that looks exactly like death, right up until it isn't. A military unit that went in, came back out, and never explained why. Farmers who simply stopped calling, one after another, until an entire government finally admitted it needed help it didn't fully understand either. Most of what this channel covers describes an institution testing the limits of what it can actually control. This file describes the exact moment that institution reached one of those limits, and for once, simply said so out loud. Somewhere near Lake Baikal, that fence is still standing tonight. I'm Shroudex. See you in the dark. There's a reason this file has remained one of the most referenced entries in this entire archive. For as long as it has, long after flashier, more visually dramatic entries have come and gone from casual conversation, it doesn't need a monster you can picture clearly to be unsettling. It just needs an organization built around the promise of control, admitting, in its own internal paperwork, that control was never actually on the table here, and that the best it's ever managed is holding still long enough for nothing worse to happen yet. If there's one image worth carrying out of this episode, let it be the fence itself, ordinary, unremarkable, disguised as something as boring as a training exercise, holding back something no facility on Earth was ever built to contain. Sometimes the scariest file in this entire archive isn't the one with the biggest monster. It's the one that finally stops pretending it has an answer.